This isn't a video made for views or algorithms. This is the video I needed in my own awakening, the one that would have saved me years of pain if someone had just said these words out loud. And if you are an empath and you feel alone in your journey, I made this for you. Picture this. You are in the middle of explaining yourself for what feels like the 100th time. Your chest is tight. Your mind scans every word before it leaves your mouth. You rearrange sentences so they won't sound too harsh, too sensitive, too much. Across from you, a face that looks angry, or defensive, or indifferent. So you try harder. More context, more backstory, more emotional translation. I understand why that hurt you. I did not mean it that way. This is what I was actually feeling. You have done this so many times, the body could perform it like a ritual. The empathic reflex, the self-erasure pattern. And then, one day, something quiet happens. The words are there, but the impulse to offer them simply does not move. Not from anger, not from defiance, just a profound, unfamiliar stillness. A clean silence settles in the chest, as if the psyche steps one pace back and watches the whole scene from the outside. And in that stillness comes a realization that feels almost unsettling. No amount of explaining will fix this. What looks like exhaustion on the surface is actually something else. Something Carl Jung wrote about with almost prophetic precision. A threshold, a psychic reversal. A moment where the soul interferes with the ego's survival routines and says, "This is the end of the old pattern." Most people call it burnout. Others call it shutting down. But if you have lived inside this dynamic long enough, you can feel that something far older is moving underneath the moment. Because for the first time, you are not rushing outward. You are not merging. You are not translating yourself into someone else's emotional language. Your awareness turns inward. And suddenly, the larger architecture of your life becomes visible. The over-explaining, the shrinking, the self-doubt, the gravitational pull toward people who cannot meet you, especially toward the narcissistic structures that feed on what they cannot create. And here is the recognition that rarely arrives without a chill. This entire pattern was never random. The relationships, the chemistry, the unspoken ache, the way your empathy keeps choosing the same familiar woundedness in others. None of this happened by accident. Something deeper has been shaping this. Something psychological and archetypal. Something Jung would call psychic inevitability. Not fate as punishment, but fate as initiation. And this silence, this halt in your lifelong reflex, is the first crack in the illusion that has shaped your entire relational existence. And what lies beneath that illusion is where our story truly begins. If the last part was the crack in the surface, this next part is where we enter the underworld beneath it. People assume empaths give too much because they are naturally kind or generous or afraid of conflict. Jung would say that is not the real reason. The deeper truth is this. The empath over-explains because the empath is afraid of disappearing. Afraid that if they do not soften every truth, if they do not translate their inner world perfectly, if they do not manage the other person's perception, they will be abandoned. And that fear did not begin in adulthood. Most empaths were trained into this pattern. Before they even had language for it, they grew up sensing tension before it erupted, managing the moods of adults, reading danger in the space between breaths, making themselves small enough to avoid abandonment, soft enough to avoid punishment. They learned a silent rule of survival. If I can understand you completely, you will not reject me. That early wound, that ancient fear, is what makes the empath a perfect mirror. for the kinds of psyches that cannot see them. This is not chemistry and not a coincidence. This is polarity, a magnetic pull between two halves of an unhealed story finding each other in the dark. Jung wrote, "That which we refuse to confront within returns to us as fate." And so the empath's life becomes a loop. The hunger to be seen returns as people who cannot see them. The fear of being unlovable returns as relationships where love must be earned. The over-responsibility returns as people who hand them the emotional labor. This is karmic geometry, not punishment, but repetition, until consciousness interrupts. And the interruption always begins the same way, with silence. But before that silence becomes a doorway, it becomes something else first, a mirror. Because buried under every explanation, every emotional translation, every attempt to be understood is a truth the empath has avoided for a lifetime. You are not just afraid of being misunderstood. You are afraid of being unlovable. This fear is the gatekeeper Jung called the shadow. To enter the shadow is not to enter darkness, it is to enter the part of the psyche the empath was taught never to look at. Jung said the shadow contains everything we learn to hide, not because it is evil, but because it once felt dangerous. And for the empath, the shadow begins with one sentence. I learned to disappear so others would stay. They became emotionally vigilant and hyper-attuned, long before they had words for the terror underneath it. This is why the empath and the narcissist recognize each other instantly. The connection feels chemical, inevitable, electric. But it is not the person they are drawn to. It is the wound. Two shadows facing each other. Two wounds calling each other by name. And this is where the mythic dimension enters. Not as story, but as archetype. Because the empath's wound is not just psychological. It is mythic. It carries the signature of a soul that has never felt it truly belonged. This is where Chiron enters. And if you have stayed with me this far, what comes next is meant for you. So take a breath. Because from this point on, the story stops being metaphor and starts becoming memory. Every empath story has a turning point. But that turning point never begins in adulthood. It begins in the oldest wound, and no archetype describes this wound more precisely than Chiron, the wounded healer. But not the hallmark version, not the soft, poetic version. The real Chiron carries the blueprint of the empath's soul. Chiron was born into contradiction, half god, half mortal, claimed by neither. Too divine for the human world, too human for the gods. Not enough for either side. On the surface, he did not belong anywhere. His wound was not merely physical. His wound was existential. He was a being who existed between worlds and had no world that felt like home. And so he did what many empaths unconsciously do. He tried to earn belonging by offering what he could not receive. He healed, taught, and guided others into their greatness. He poured himself into the wounds of others, hoping, perhaps without knowing, that enough giving would reveal where he finally belonged. Does this not echo the empath's life script? Standing between worlds, between roles, between strength and fragility, between giving and breaking. Able to feel others deeply, yet unable to soothe the wound of feeling fundamentally unseen. Chiron's wound was not that he was hurt. Chiron's wound was that he did not belong, and that is the empath's wound too. The narcissist fears insignificance, so they inflate. The empath fears unlovability, so they disappear. It is archetypal choreography. This is why Jung called these encounters a meeting of shadows before a meeting of selves. The empath looks at the narcissist and feels a gravitational ache. If I can love you into healing, maybe the universe will finally show me where I belong. They are not trying to fix the narcissist's wound. They are trying to heal the wound inside themselves, by proxy. If what I described was a descent into shadow, this upcoming moment is where the archetype reveals itself. Because one day, mid-argument, mid-explanation, mid-self-erasure, the empath finally sees the truth with a clarity that feels like a psychic earthquake. What am I chasing in you? What did I abandon in myself? This sentence is the hinge the entire story has been turning on. It is the moment Jung called Enantiodromia, when a pattern pushed to its extreme reverses into its opposite. Too much merging becomes separation. Too much self-abandonment becomes self-return. The spell breaks. The magnet reverses polarity. The pattern cannot continue because the archetype has been seen. Chiron's myth mirrors the empath's revelation. The wound was never asking to be healed by another. The wound was asking to be seen by you all along. Only then can the next stage begin. The stage where the empath stops running toward the wound and begins returning toward the self. The shadow has been seen, and what is seen can finally be healed. Here is the moment Jung believed every soul eventually reaches. The moment when the wound stops being a doorway you fall through and becomes a doorway you walk through consciously. Up until now, the empath's life was filled with questions. Why do I feel everything? Why do I attract those who take? Why do I love in ways that leave me empty? But Jung would say, these are not questions of personality. They are questions of destiny. They arise the moment the self begins calling the ego back home, because the empath's journey was never about the narcissist. It was never about the relationships. It was always leading here, to the moment the soul reveals what all that suffering was pointing toward. And Chiron's myth gives us the map. After a lifetime of healing others, of giving more than he ever received, Chiron faced a wound he could not cure, and instead of fighting it, he did something unfathomable. He surrendered the wound, not for escape, but for transformation. And the gods, recognizing the truth of his journey, lifted him into the heavens, not as man or god, but as constellation, a being who finally belonged. Because he realized he was the belonging. He did not need a world to claim him. He claimed himself. This is the empath's turning point. The wound was never proof that something was wrong with you. It was proof that something inside you was trying to wake up. The longing you carried, to be seen, to be understood, to be received without shrinking, was never about another person. It was your own soul calling you back. Read that again. The love you were searching for is the very love that was searching for you. This is the revelation most people never reach. Because this is the revelation you only touch after the pattern breaks. And the pattern breaks with what Jung called the withdrawal of libido from the object, a clean psychic reversal, the fire losing its oxygen, what the world casually calls going silent. But the silent protocol is not ghosting, not coldness, not detachment, not punishment. It is something far more powerful. Because what actually breaks the pattern is not the silence itself, but the disappearance of need. The need to be understood and believed. The need to justify your boundaries, or your feelings, or your truth. For your entire life, your explanations were not just words. They were bridges. And every time you crossed those bridges, to clarify, soothe, or translate yourself, the narcissistic psyche received the same message. I still matter. I still have access to you. This is why nothing ever changed. Not because you were not clear, but because your need to be understood kept the karmic door open. The silent protocol closes that door, but without slamming it. It simply stops supplying the one resource. The dynamic depends on your emotional response. A narcissistic psyche does not feed on love. It feeds on reaction. Your confusion, your clarity, your hurt, your explanations, even your attempts at peace, become emotional fuel. But when you become still, when you stop explaining and no longer reach outward to repair what was never yours to hold, something extraordinary happens. The narcissist loses access, not to you, but to the part of you that kept the pattern alive. Your silence becomes something they cannot read, predict, or manipulate. It disorients them, not because you withdrew, but because for the first time, their strategies no longer work on you. They cannot hook into what does not react. They cannot dominate what does not explain. They cannot drain what no longer overgives its energy. So the silent protocol is not the end of connection. It is the end of control. It does not end the relationship. It ends the spell. This is the moment. The empath stops orienting around another's wound and returns to their own center, quietly, clearly, without apology. This silence is not emptiness. It is fullness. It is the moment Chiron realizes he was never meant to belong to mortals or gods. He was meant to belong to himself. It is the moment the empath realizes the thing I kept begging others to give me is the thing I am finally able to give myself. This is not self-love as cliché. This is self-love as initiation. The moment the soul replaces the pattern, the moment the self replaces the wound, the moment you belong to yourself more than you belong to your past. Jung wrote, "The privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are." For the empath, this is what it means. Not becoming harder, colder, or less sensitive, but finally becoming whole. Once this shift begins, the narcissist's pull dissolves, the karmic magnet unwinds, the ancestral loop ends with you. You do not rise above the pattern because you are better. You rise above the pattern because you are awake. And once you are awake, the pattern cannot continue. The karmic contract completes itself. The polarity collapses. The mirror stops holding your reflection. The wound is no longer your gravitational center. You are. If you take nothing else from this journey, take this. You were never meant to heal your way into someone else's heart. You were meant to return to your own. You were never meant to contort yourself into belonging. You were meant to remember. You are the belonging. You are the home. You are the center your own soul has been trying to return to for lifetimes. And now, finally, it has. This is where the loop ends. This is where the soul begins. And this, right now, is where you begin again. If this found you at the right moment, if something in you softened or cracked open or finally felt seen, I want you to know this. You are not alone in this awakening. Below this video, leave a comment. Not for the algorithm, but for the version of you who once felt invisible. Tell your story. Your words may become the lifeline for someone who has not yet found theirs. Thank you for meeting this moment with honesty, with courage, and with the quiet strength of a soul finally returning to its true essence. I will see you in the next video.